There are moments in history that feel less like reality and more like deleted scenes from a dystopian film. Stories so surreal you assume they must be myth, exaggeration, internet folklore, until you follow the paper trail, until the letters surface, until the funding documents exist, until the victims leave testimonies. This is one of those stories. Because in the 1920s, a Soviet scientist named Ilya Ivanov didn't just theorize about crossing humans with apes. He attempted it, methodically, seriously, with government support. Not in fiction, not in metaphor, in laboratories, in institutions, with real people, and the world almost forgot. Let's talk about the real-life Planet of the Apes experiment. Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov was not a madman scribbling in the margins of forbidden books. That's the part that makes this story unsettling. He was a respected biologist, a pioneer in artificial insemination, a scientist celebrated across Europe for his work with animals. By the early 20th century, Ivanov had already successfully experimented with cross-species reproduction among livestock. He had worked on hybridization between different species of horses and zebras, between cattle varieties. He was invited to conferences. He was funded. He was respected. In other words, when he spoke, people listened. And somewhere along the way, Ivanov became obsessed with a question that many scientists had quietly wondered, but few dared pursue. What if humans could be crossed with apes? Not metaphorically, not evolutionarily, literally. His hypothesis was rooted in evolutionary theory. Humans and chimpanzees share a close genetic relationship. He believed that hybridization might be biologically possible, but unlike academic speculation, Ivanov wanted proof. He didn't want discussion, he wanted results. So he approached the Soviet government. To understand why this even gained traction, you need to understand the era. This was the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. The Soviet Union was attempting to redefine humanity itself. Religion was being dismantled, the old moral frameworks were seen as relics, science was being elevated as the new guiding force. The Bolshevik leadership was deeply invested in ideas about reshaping human nature, the creation of the new Soviet man, the idea that humanity could be engineered, improved, redefined. In that environment, Ivanov's work didn't sound insane. It sounded radical, revolutionary, symbolic. A scientific strike against religion, a demonstration that humans were animals, a biological argument against the soul. So they funded him. Not openly, not publicly, but enough to begin the project. Ivanov traveled to French Guinea, now Guinea-Conakry, where a primate research facility housed chimpanzees. He began his first phase of experiments there. The plan was straightforward, disturbingly straightforward. He would use artificial insemination to attempt fertilization between humans and chimpanzees. The initial experiments involved inseminating female chimpanzees with human sperm. Let's pause here, not because of shock value, but because of clarity. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't theoretical. This wasn't abstract philosophy. This was a deliberate attempt to create a human-chimpanzee hybrid, a Humanzee. Ivanov carried out multiple attempts. Records suggest that none of the chimpanzees became pregnant. The experiments failed biologically, but he didn't stop. He didn't conclude that the idea was flawed. Instead, he decided the next phase was necessary. The more controversial phase. The one that would involve human women. This is where the story crosses from unethical science into something much darker. Ivanov proposed that female human subjects should be inseminated with ape sperm. He attempted to organize this under the guise of voluntary participation. In theory, consent was supposed to exist. In reality, power dynamics, coercion, social vulnerability, and manipulation cloud the situation heavily. There are records indicating that Ivanov attempted to recruit women who were socially marginalized. Poor, vulnerable, those with limited ability to refuse authority. He even requested access to women imprisoned under the Soviet system. Let that sink in. The state that funded the project was also responsible for incarcerating millions. And a respected scientist was requesting access to those women for experimental insemination. This wasn't science fiction. This was bureaucratic paperwork. Fortunately, not because of ethics, but because of political complications, the project never fully materialized. Ivanov's later attempts were blocked. Bureaucracy slowed him down. International scrutiny increased. His reputation became controversial. his funding dried up, not because the project was morally unacceptable, but because it became politically inconvenient. There's a difference. Eventually, Ivanov was arrested, not for human experimentation, not for ethics violations, not for crimes against humanity. He was arrested during Stalin's purges on unrelated charges and exiled to Kazakhstan, where he died in 1932. The project ended not with a moral reckoning, but with political chaos swallowing its architect. Which leaves us with an uncomfortable question. If he had lived longer, if political winds had shifted differently, if the bureaucracy had been more efficient, if the funding had continued, how far would it have gone? It's tempting to frame this story as mad scientist territory, a lone eccentric pushing boundaries, but that interpretation is comforting and inaccurate. Ivanov wasn't operating in isolation. He was operating within institutional support. Scientific communities knew of his work, government officials authorized funding, international organizations were aware of his experiments. The danger wasn't one man. The danger was a system willing to entertain the idea. That's the real horror here, not the experiment, the permission. The story also forces us to confront something uncomfortable about scientific progress itself. We often speak about science as inherently moral, as if knowledge itself carries virtue. But history tells a different story. Science gave us antibiotics. Science also gave us eugenics. Science gave us vaccines. Science also gave us forced sterilization programs. Science gave us space travel. Science also gave us chemical weapons. The question has never been, can we? The real question has always been, who is allowed to say no? Ivanov's work sits right in that uncomfortable territory. Not because the biology was necessarily plausible, but because the ethical boundary was treated as flexible, and that should sound familiar. Fast forward to today. We have gene editing technologies like CRISPR, we have cloning capabilities, we have embryonic manipulation, we have artificial womb research, we have neural implants, we have bioengineering that Ivanov couldn't have dreamed of. The technology has evolved. The ethical questions haven't. We still live in a world where marginalized people become experimental populations, where medical trials disproportionately recruit from vulnerable communities, where consent is often shaped by desperation rather than autonomy. Ivanov's story isn't just a historical oddity, it's a mirror. It asks, who gets experimented on when curiosity outpaces compassion? Who pays the price when ambition outruns ethics? Who becomes material rather than human? And here's the part most people don't like confronting. Ivanov wasn't driven by cruelty, he was driven by curiosity. That's the unsettling part. He believed he was expanding human knowledge. He believed he was pushing scientific frontiers. He believed history would thank him. He didn't wake up thinking, how can I harm people today? He woke up thinking, how can I prove this theory? And that's precisely why ethics matter more than intellect, because intelligence without boundaries doesn't create progress. It creates casualties. There's another layer to this story that's rarely discussed: race. Ivanov conducted his earliest experiments in colonial Africa, French Guinea, a place where black bodies were already being exploited under colonial systems, where consent was ambiguous at best, where power imbalance was structural. The question of whose bodies were considered acceptable for experimentation cannot be separated from the racial hierarchies of the time. Scientific racism was still alive, eugenics was mainstream, ideas about primitive humans and evolutionary hierarchy were treated as legitimate. When you understand that context, the experiment becomes less of an anomaly and more of a symptom of a world that categorized some humans as closer to animals than others. A world that justified experimentation based on proximity to power. That legacy hasn't vanished, it's just updated its language. Today, when people joke about Humanzees or treat this as internet trivia, it sanitizes what actually happened. This wasn't curiosity gone wrong. This was power testing how far it could go. It was science asking, how much can we justify in the name of knowledge? How far can we stretch morality before someone stops us? And the answer, historically, has been further than we'd like to admit. There's no evidence that any hybrid was ever created. Biologically, the chances were slim to begin with. Human and chimpanzee reproductive systems are similar, but not identical. The genetic barriers are substantial. Even if fertilization had occurred, successful gestation would have been extraordinarily unlikely. But that's not the point. The point isn't whether he succeeded. The point is that he tried, that he was allowed to try, that institutions entertained the idea seriously enough to fund it. Failure doesn't absolve intent. If anything, Ivanov's story should make us far more cautious about how we view scientific authority, because when someone wears a lab coat, holds a title, and speaks with confidence, people often suspend moral judgment. We assume expertise equals virtue, we assume credentials equal wisdom, we assume progress equals goodness. History repeatedly proves otherwise. Some of the most harmful projects in history were led by educated, respected professionals. Not villains. Professionals. So when we hear today about genetic modification of embryos, about designer traits, about biohacking communities, about private companies experimenting on biology, about governments funding controversial research, we should remember Ivanov, not as a monster, but as a warning, a reminder that curiosity is not enough, that intelligence is not enough, that capability is not justification, because science without ethics doesn't liberate humanity. It experiments on it. And maybe that's why this story still unsettles nearly a century later. Not because of what almost happened biologically, but because of what already happened ethically. The line was crossed in the mind long before it was crossed in the body. The decision was made that some people were acceptable risk. That's the true horror. Not right, not left, just real.